Hello everyone. So today we are going to be talking about globalisation, and I want to introduce you to some sociologists who are working in this space. It's a very important area for contemporary sociology. Globalisation is really an unavoidable word, not just in sociology. It's used extensively by politicians, journalists, people in the business world, activists, religious leaders, etc. It has both positive and negative meanings. The primary meaning in political journalist circles tends to relate to economic factors, but there are other factors as well that I'm going to be talking about. So often you'll think about or hear about global capitalism meaning the network of transnational corporations and big business in the world, the idea of free markets that span the globe, and this global reach of capitalist systems of production now and consumption, and what's regarded as a new form or an adaptation of capitalism as well in the world. On the political right, global capitalism tends to be seen as primarily positive, so the focus there is on jobs creation, opportunities creation, wealth creation, improved standards of living. On the political left, you'll often see that global capitalism has a concern with social problems and issues that it causes for people, and environmental disasters. When it comes to environmental issues, these are now understood, despite the contentions around people who don't believe that there are concerns. However, I think there's enough awareness in the world now that this is understood to be a global problem. And there's certainly an awareness now of unintended consequences of human impact on the environment, and that has become a problem. So in the social sciences, the notion, what we're interested in is an analysis of globalisation, what it means, how it works, what effects it has, and where. The notion of a society as a self-enclosed, bounded entity has really come under heavy criticism. It seems highly unsuited now for talking about the transnational process associated with globalisation. The very notion of society itself may now be obsolete because of globalisation. Can we still talk about Australian society or British society or French or Japanese society, for example? So there are questions being raised because the idea of society is no longer primarily contained within one particular country or state, because there are so many processes and phenomena that exist beyond and across and above the confines of nation states, that are focused just on nation states now can miss what is being transformed by globalisation. So globalisation therefore raises questions about the current value of classic theories. And I'll just read, for those who are listening only, a quote from Ulrich Beck. The association between sociology and nation state was so extensive that the image of modern, organised individual societies, which became definitive within the national model of political organisation itself, became an absolutely necessary concept in and through the founding work of classical social scientists, beyond all their differences, such theorists as Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and even Karl Marx shared this territorial definition of modern society, and thus a model of society centred on the nation state. But that's now been shaken by globality and globalisation, end of quote. So this term methodological nationalism has been coined. It is a social theory that takes society in general, or particular societies, or particular national societies in particular, as its primary concern, is now guilty of this methodological nationalism, according to Hermione Martins in 1974. So methodological nationalism has been identified as a practice within social science and has been critiqued by those who argue that the nation state and its borders are now insufficient. It's an insufficient unit of analysis, and that the national or is at times the terrain actually of the global. So methodological nationalism can mean ignoring or disregarding the importance of nationalism for modern societies, naturalisation, and confining studies to geopolitical boundaries, and think there of a particular nation state. So this thinking about globalisation and going back to how it's often seen as an economic process, I want to spend a bit of time on that. And this spread of capitalism was predicted by Marx and Engels back in the middle of the 19th century when they said the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the surface of the globe. It batters down all Chinese walls, think national boundaries. It compels all nations on pain of extension to adopt the bourgeois mode of production and to introduce what it calls civilization into their boundaries and insist that they become bourgeois themselves. So where globalization is primarily about money, about capitalism, this spread of capitalism was predicted. Marx and Engels, their contention was that all regions of the world would eventually be transformed by capitalism, with traditions being swept away and replaced with a novel world-encompassing social order centred on the search for profit. Both defenders and critics of capitalism share some of Marx and Engels' views about globalisation, essentially involving the global spread of capitalism from the West to the rest of the world. So for some people that's a good thing, for others not so much. Somebody who took up the analysis of Marx and Engels was Vladimir Lenin, and for those who don't know about him, his dates are 1870 to 1924. He was a communist revolutionary, head of the Soviet Russia from 1917 to 1924, and head of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1924. He was a champion of socialism and the working class, and founder, in the view of some people, founder of a really oppressive and authoritarian regime. As I said, he took up that analysis of Marx and Engels and said that by around the First World War, capitalism had already grown into a world system of colonial oppression, and the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world was being done or had been done by a handful of advanced countries. Taking up some of Lenin's analytical orientation in the present day is world systems analysis, and this has become the most influential model for analysing the world economy. And that leads me to Immanuel Wallerstein, who was born in 1930. He's an American sociologist, has degrees from Columbia University in New York. He's had a long and respected academic career since the 1950s and has held positions internationally, for example, in Hong Kong and Canada and the Netherlands. But since 2000, he's been a senior research scholar at Yale University. Now, a world system for Wallerstein is not necessarily global in scope, but is a system which creates its own distinct world. It is multipolitical, multicultural. It forms a system which pulls into the same orbit different political and cultural entities, and these develop patterned forms of interaction with each other. He rejects the idea of something called a third world, claiming that there's only one world connected by a complex network of economic exchange relationships, that is, a world economy or world system. And he locates the origin of the modern world system in the 16th century in Western Europe and the Americas. World systems become the focus then of inquiry for him rather than nation states. So the way in which he conceptualizes this is that the world is divided into this lasting division into core, semi-periphery and periphery, and where that's an inherent feature, he believes, of a world system theories. So he reckons there is a fundamental and institutionally stabilised division of labour between the core and the periphery. While the core has a high level of technological development and manufactures complex products, the role of the periphery is to supply the raw materials, the agricultural products, and cheap labour for the expanding agents of the core. The economic exchange between core and periphery takes place on unequal terms. The periphery is forced to sell its products at low prices, but then has to buy the core's products at comparatively high prices. And once established, Wallerstein reckons this unequal state tends to stabilise itself. The statuses of core and periphery are not exclusive and fixed geographically, but are relative to each other. And so a zone, and he's got this zone called the semi-periphery, which acts as a periphery to the core and as a core to the periphery. For him, the core dominates and controls, and the periphery is dominated and controlled and exploited. The semi-periphery keeps the whole system functioning by connecting the core and periphery in a way that suits the core. Going on is this three-tiered system where in the core, that's what he sees as primarily those countries in Western Europe and North America. He sees them as the exploiters, and currently the US is dominant there. So the core is developed countries, which incorporate higher levels of education, higher salaries, and more technology. And core processes, he says, is generating more wealth in the world economy. When it comes to the periphery, that's the underdeveloped countries. He sees those in Africa, parts of Latin America and Asia, which incorporate lower levels of education, lower salaries, use less technology, and those peripheral processes generate less wealth in the world. And in between, he's got this semi-periphery, which are the developing countries. Think there of India and China. He's also got Brazil incorporated there as well. He sees those countries as both exploited and exploiters. So these are places where core and periphery processes are both occurring, and therefore they're places that are exploited by the core, but in turn they exploit the periphery. So Wallerstein believes that capitalism will self-destruct, that those cheap sources of labour that come from the periphery will dry up, profits will be harder to achieve, environmental awareness will impose new levies and increasingly high levies on companies, which in turn will drive costs up, and there is a growing anti-capitalist and anti-American sentiment in the world. Ironically, he says, as the world becomes more global, more people become aware of these global issues as well. I want to go now to Zygmunt Bauman, who was another sociologist interested in these processes of globalization. He was born in Poland. His parents were non-practicing Jews, and his father was an accountant, and they left Poland. His family left Poland when the Germans invaded in 1979, and they went to the USSR. Later on, Bauman became a member of the Polish First Army and had a successful military career. In 1953, he was dishonourably discharged from the Polish First Army because his father made some inquiries about emigrating to Israel from the USSR. From 1954 to 1968, Bauman taught at the University of Warsaw, and in 1968 he was expelled from the Communist Party along with thousands of other Jews as a result of what was called the Six-Day War, which was a conflict between Israel and Palestine in 1967. He was expelled from his job and he moved to the United Kingdom after a few years in Israel. He took up residency in England, in the city of Leeds in northern England, in West Yorkshire, and he remained there and became a very eminent sociologist. He died in 2017. Now, he was living in an area which, during the Industrial Revolution, occupied the thinking of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Leeds was a major industrial centre with mills and factories for processing wool, as well as printing presses. But by the 1970s, much of this manufacturing base was disappearing. And there was a period of devastation, really, of transition between the manufacturing base disappearing and Leeds becoming what it is now, which is a financial and cultural hub for the whole of the Yorkshire area. Bauman taught at the University of Leeds, which is one of the 4 universities in the city. I wanted to also mention Janina Bauman. Bauman was married in 1948 to Janina. She was born in 1926 in Warsaw, Poland. During the Second World War, she and her sister and mother were held as prisoners in the Warsaw Ghetto, and you can read about that in a book called Zookeeper's Wife. But she then managed to escape and stayed with a peasant family in a country area of Poland. And just to mention that she actually came from quite a well-off middle-class family and then had this whole other different outlook on life. She found out about the death of her father, who was an army officer, when she was one day peeling potatoes using newspaper to put the peelings into, and there was a list of the dead in the newspaper, and that's how she found out that her father had died. After the war, she became a journalist, and then she moved with Bauman to the UK and became a writer while caring for her family. And she's got a couple of books out, author of 2 autobiographical books, Winter in the Morning and A Dream of Belonging. And I wanted to mention that the Bauman Institute at the University of Leeds set up an award for the best PhD dissertation in Janina's honour in 2011, and that's called the Janina Bauman Prize. So if you're interested in it, I'd encourage you to read her books. I often think that the women are missed out, forgotten about. She was clearly an important figure, so I'd encourage you to have a look at some of her work too. Now, Bauman, particularly later on in his life, was very interested in this term that he coined called liquid modernity. So he moved from the idea of postmodernity and used instead this idea of liquid modernity to describe what he saw as constant mobility and change in all manner of social life, in relationship, in identities, economics, and migration. He's been very interested in the social and economic consequences of transnational mobility, and he points out that that the movement across the globe of people means very different things to different groups of people. So those living in affluent countries, and we can include Australia in that, in advanced capitalist societies, move across the globe freely. So we can go across the globe for conferences, for tourism, for holidays, for job opportunities, and for business. However, he says the vast majority of the world's population, those countries on the periphery, are usually forced to be mobile because they're fleeing wars. Think Syria. Persecution, think about the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Famine, think about South Sudan. Or people leave their countries in order to find work to support themselves and their families back home. And then in that case, they take on low-paid work such as domestic servitude and are usually found then on the social margins of the major and very wealthy cities. Therefore, mass migration, Bauman says, is dividing the world up between the very rich winners and the rest of the world. He goes on with another book called Liquid Life, and in this one he argues that life now is precarious, there is constant change, constant uncertainty, and there's not a lot of point in relying on strategies that we might have used in the past because they might not work in the future. So we might have a strategy, for example, of deciding that we're going to go and work for one particular organisation for the rest of our lives. And I do know of people, for example, who decided they were going to do that with Holden. They made a commitment to the organisation, they were happy working there, and that was going to be the rest of their life. But that strategy didn't pan out in the end because Holden's upped and moved. But he reckons because we can't rely on those those past strategies, because there is this constant change, constant uncertainty, life is now precarious, and therefore we're all anxious. So he says solidity and liquidity are the distinctive features of two eras, modernity and post-modernity. Instead of referring to modernity and post-modernity, Bauman writes of a movement from solid modernity to a more liquid social life. And as an example, identity is no longer a fact, but something that we do. It's a task that we take on. And we're not seeking necessarily an identity that will last a lifetime. We're not necessarily looking for a deeper meaning to life. Instead, he reckons we're social tourists. We're looking for the next, however fleeting, experience. Bauman has also written Liquid Love, and in this book he's interested in the way in which he reckons our traditional bonds are loosening. The old ties we had of marriage, of family, social class, religious affiliation, they're not fixed anymore. Therefore, the individual has to use their own ingenuity to negotiate a path through society. So Bauman's book is about how we're torn then between this new freedom to do things as we want to do them rather than being held by old ties, but also longing for the old security, because as much as there might have been things that we didn't like about the old affiliations, there was also a sense of security and belonging. So the result is much anxiety as well as we're being torn. And when it comes to love, what he says is that we want love to give us what our other consumer products or purchases give us: lots of novelty, fun, variety. Therefore, relationships are now quite disposable too. I want to just move on to thinking about globalisation as political processes, and Marx and Engels again made a prediction that global capitalism would limit the power of national governments to control what happens within their borders. So capitalist markets are now transnational. Therefore, information, goods, people, etc. move across borders without respecting national governments. And think, therefore, of the controversy that we've had in this country since 2004 or a little bit earlier than that about so-called people smugglers, but also think about shopping online and being able to bypass GST. Transnational companies can pack up and leave. I talked about somebody who might have had a strategy of working, and I know people who did, who had a strategy of working for one particular organisation. That's not necessarily going to work anymore because those big companies might pack up and leave, as Toyota and Holden have done in Australia or from Australia. There are more constraints than previously on national governments, which come from international laws, from the United Nations, from Amnesty International, and even Greenpeace activism. So even while I have a little bit of scepticism about this, because I know that Australia doesn't always abide by agreements it signs up with for the United Nations. However, we do sign up and agree with various conventions, and it does constrain in some ways what we can do. And because it's also difficult to control now information coming into national borders, and think about that in terms of the internet, although China has more of a handle on controlling what goes in to their national borders. So in other words, boundaries of nation states are more porous than previously. Things can pour in and pour out more easily than previously. When it comes to globalisation as social processes, the constraints of geography are receding. So the forces that shape and influence people are no longer simply local or national, but also global. And Anthony Giddens back in 1990 wrote, and I'm quoting, "The intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa." And therefore, what happens in a local area can be affected by what is happening in the global economy. And what comes to mind for me is the global financial crisis. So some banking or mortgage problem occurred in the United States, and that had ripple-out effects right across the world. When Japan a few decades ago had a major recession, that had rippling effects across the globe. If China, for example, collapsed in its economy or even declined, then that will have rippling out effects across the globe and huge impacts, particularly for Australia. Also, relationships are no longer geographically constrained. We can do business, know people from all over the world, and our contemporary social relationships become disembedded from the past in particular. So we can do other things, with relationships than we used to have. So those constraints of geography are receding, which in some ways can be seen as a positive. So if you have money, you can buy a hotel room anywhere in the world, and expert knowledge, for example, means that medical doctors the world over will treat you in a similar sort of way, and that can lead to a lot of ontological security, so feeling safe in the world rather than anxiety, which Bauman was talking about. And think about when you travel, you can land anywhere, get a taxi or an Uber, arrive at a hotel, and it's kind of essentially the same. Takes unpredictability out of traveling. But if we put our trust in those expert systems, what happens when something goes wrong, or if we can't rely on the expert systems to be the same in some countries, then we would need to do a risk assessment. And that leads me to Ulrich Beck, who, along with Giddens and some others, has worked on this idea of risk in society for some time. So he's a German sociologist. I'm sure you've come across him already. He's been working as a sociologist since 1972, and from 1992 until his death, he died in 2015, he was Professor of Sociology at the University of Munich. Now, his research interests include an interest in the disasters created by the use of technology, and in particular, he's interested in the paradox between what we think of as progress, so the apparent wealth in the West, for example, and then this sense of increased risk we have because of the impact of technological advances. His book, World Risk Society, is one of the most influential academic books of the 20th century, translated into 20 languages, sold more than 80,000 copies across the world, which is fantastic for an academic book. It's not like some of the other literary books, which can sell millions. It was published in 1986, the same year as the Chernobyl disaster that happened on the 26th of April that year, 1986, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. And then it went on to be published in English in 1992. And just a point about Chernobyl, that nuclear power plant failure triggered substantial amounts of nuclear radiation into the atmosphere. One figure I've seen quoted as 400 times that released by the bombs over Hiroshima. So what Beck has done is that this historical mapping of risks associated with being human, and he has the first historical period as being pre-industrialization, where the biggest concern for humanity were natural disasters, things like floods and droughts and volcanoes, contagious diseases. So these were exogenous, they were externally caused, not caused by humans. They did have absolutely a tangible impact, and the risks were impacted as well by a lack of knowledge. So there were no warning systems if a hurricane was coming, for example, and we have those now, and there was no understanding of the impact of hygiene, so people tended to live in incredibly unsanitary conditions, including, for example, throwing toilet with sewage waste into streets. So they didn't have the understanding of hygiene that we do have now. So that's what he sees as the first period where the biggest concern for humanity or for societies were external to society. So then in the second period, what we've got is industrialization. So then and industrialization, of course, as you would know, leads to the manufacture of goods and away from an economy based on farming or agriculture. And in the West, this occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries, and some developing countries are going through this process now. So we still have those natural disasters, plus we have a human error, And so we have industrial accidents, and for one example is the Triangle Shirt Waste Factory fire in New York in 1911, but really there are just so many to choose from. So we have these social goods, employment, income, housing, which are offset by the side effects or the social bads. And then we move into technological disasters that are actually created by our technology. So what he calls techno-scientific development. And one example there is thalidomide. So thalidomide is a drug that was given to pregnant women to stop morning sickness during the late 1950s and early 1960s. And it was in widespread use in Australia, Europe and Japan and other countries. And there were thousands of babies who died or were born with problems with their organs or born without limbs. And there was an Australian doctor called William McBride, who was from Sydney, and he's credited with revealing the dangers of thalidomide. And he published an article in The Lancet in 1961 stating that whereas congenital abnormalities are about 1.5% of babies, when thalidomide is used or taken by women, the deformities increase up to 20%. And the Lancet article was the catalyst for further studies. And when the link was found, the drug was banned in Australia in 1961, although I do understand it's used for another completely unrelated condition. So now we have a situation where we have natural disasters, then we have industrial disasters created by human error, and then we have disasters created by human techno-scientific development as well. So we have those three areas. So he's done this mapping of increased risk in the world. So he talks about this transition from industrial modernity to risk society in the 1980s, where he reckons manufactured risks multiply quickly, spread like a virus. And he argued that since the 1980s, people in Western cultures have become increasingly disenchanted with the ability, or the disability actually, of institutions we have, our governments, our legal system, our knowledge systems, particularly our scientific knowledge, to prevent or to contain our risks. And media reports, of course, report those social bads. And Beck's argument is that the central focus then becomes on avoiding the bad rather than on producing the risks. So we become very attuned to risks and not prepared to take risks, become very risk averse is the phrase. And so some of those social bads, and my goodness, there are any number of them, but there was Chernobyl that I've mentioned, there was the nuclear disaster at Fukushima in Japan, there is ongoing problems in Port Pirie in South Australia where the lead levels from the lead smelters create problems in the community, not just respiratory problems, but can cause developmental delay in children in that community as well. So he summed up his argument recently in 2000 with 8 points. That risk is about potential catastrophe. It's not the same as something having actually happened, like destruction, but it is about the potential for it. So the discourse of risk begins where trust ends. It's the space between the security that we did have and the actual event or destruction. So it's the no longer, but not yet. He talks about this idea of the spectre of the future. The present is not determined by the past anymore, but by what actually might happen in the future. So that's a sense of risk. He talks about it as a mathematized morality. It's not just factual claims, but it also is claims about values, about how we want to live in the world and how we want to treat people. These are unintended consequences, is his fourth point, that order and control becomes increasingly impossible because we don't intend for things to happen. We don't intend for that thalidomide disaster. The intention there was a good intention, but the outcome, the consequence, was disastrous for many people. Number 5 is the can't say that word, synthesis of knowledge and awareness. So more and better knowledge is becoming the source of new risks. An example there is breast cancer. So he talks about the possibility of inherited disease, and we begin to blur the boundary between ill people and well people. So the more knowledge that we have that we may be at risk of breast cancer, we're not necessarily well, and I guess we might take precautions like have a mastectomy so that we don't get the breast cancer. So it actually creates more risks, that knowledge, in a way. Another example is genetic engineering, more knowledge but lack of awareness of potential risks there. And his problem with this really is that it can lead to doing nothing. We're too scared to doing nothing, really. So the risks are both local and global. So the local and the global are no longer antithetical, a point I've already raised, and I use the example of the GFC there. The risks are both real and constructed, so the impacts of the risks are actually real, they are tangible, they happen in the world, but the knowledge about the risks is also tied to the history and symbols of a particular culture. An example he has is the impact of asbestos in causing cancer. Now that was absolutely real, no doubt about that, but how the risk is perceived can vary in time and place, and there's often this lapse in time between a condition that cancer causes, asbestos, and the recognition of it, or what he says, it's knowable only after it materialises into a visible cultural phenomenon at some time and some place. So there's no doubt that there were people who died of asbestos-caused cancer long before organisations began to be sued for that. And I guess that litigation was one way of bringing that into consciousness, making it a visible cultural phenomenon. And he reckons that now we live in what he calls a hybrid world, that there's this loss of clear distinction between nature and culture. So risk society, he says, and I'm quoting now for those who are listening and not watching, is the driving force in the, he says, I'll start again, the driving force in the class society can be summarised in the phrase, I am hungry. The movement set in motion by the risk society, on the other hand, is expressed in the statement, I am afraid. The commonality of anxiety takes the place of the commonality of hunger. When it comes to globalisation as cultural processes, events like the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, a royal wedding compel us to see ourselves as part of a global whole. However, the global whole is not homogeneous, but a really complex mix of different cultures. And the challenge is to explore the transplanting of one cultural expression into another locality. An example there for me is the ubiquity of Italian and Chinese food and how that changes as it comes into a different locality. So, for example, you'll see a lot more meat in Indian food in Australia or in the United Kingdom than you would in India. Marxists argue that cultural imperialism is thus happening, that the mass media companies become the Trojan horses of capitalist and consumerist values, particularly from the West to the rest. That is, it's the core who make and distribute media products to the periphery. Or is it that people's cultural experiences are a mix of the local, the national, and the global? That is, this cultural hybridisation, and perhaps that's something that we could discuss in class. So in summary, globalisation is a really important focus in contemporary sociology. It encompasses everything happening everywhere, and understanding the global forces that shape us will actually give us more options for thinking about solving problems, strategies for living in the world, and I guess increasingly the need to be aware, to be adaptable in the world.